Hi everyone. If you're listening to this, then we're back in school and hopefully things are starting to get back to normal. This is being recorded at the end of the summer holidays. I hope that everyone is safe and sound and well coming back into school. I personally can't wait to get slowly back to normal and to see you all again. I guess the point of this video is to sort of refresh our memory, because we did a little bit of socialism right at the end of last term. We just got to the Communist Manifesto and what is in that, and we've then had a long break away from it. So what I'm going to do is just give you a refresh of your memory of socialism, key socialist, and what socialism is, and what you believe in if you describe yourself as a socialist. So the first thing and the most important thing that I want you to know is that socialism is such a broad ideology that very many different people and individuals in politics may describe themselves as a socialist. Now, the first key thinker, alongside with his friend Friedrich Engels, and I feel sorry for Engels because he gets forgotten about a little bit, is Karl Marx. Now, that is not to say that Karl Marx is the first socialist, but he's the first to put socialist ideas into one place when he and Friedrich Engels write the Communist Manifesto in 1848. Before this point, a lot of socialists or communists were referred to as utopians. They were people that believed they could build a utopia, a more perfect world. A good example of it, if you want to research a utopian, is Robert Owen, who I believe was local to the northwest, but he had factory up in Lanarkshire in Scotland, and what he had for his workers was almost a community, a shop with subsidised prices to make sure that every family could eat, an education system for his workers. When we study the Industrial Revolution and factory owners, we often ignore people like Robert Owen, who had quite genuine concerns about the well-being of their workers. We often focus on the very worst of factory owners. But what Robert Owen does is he tries to set up a utopia in America. Now, when he leaves, and I believe he leaves his son in charge, but in his absence, things all fall apart. So if you want to research an early socialist, you might want to look at Robert Owen. And sixth form historians, you will have studied the Levellers and the Diggers in year 12. Maybe because of the disruption to term, you won't be doing it until year 13. But again, socialist principles come through that, because particularly the Diggers wanted to claim land, privately owned land, and use it for the community, and it was seen as a threat to private property. So there are socialist principles in the Leveller and the Diggers, or as they're known, the True Leveller movement in the 17th century. So Karl Marx is not the first socialist, but he is our first key thinker because of this key work, the Communist Manifesto. Now, Marx was born in Germany to a Jewish father who had to hide his faith for fear of persecution. But Marx himself wasn't a religious individual. Marx referred to religion as the opium of the masses. He saw religion as a way to keep people behaving, as a method of making sure that society behaves in a way that those in power want them to. Marx bounces around Europe. He doesn't find himself particularly welcome, and you can see why when you look at some of the things that Marx writes. Marx says that a revolution is necessary and inevitable, and that capitalism must and will be overturned. So when he starts involving himself in radical newspapers in Paris and Belgium, that scares the powers that be, and Marx finds himself a stateless person. He can't go back to Germany. He bounces around Europe, eventually settles in London. Now, the Communist Manifesto, and we'll go into it in a bit more detail later, is possibly still today one of the most effective and powerful critiques of capitalism. We split the Communist Manifesto into two. One, a critique of capitalism, and two, a prediction for the future. In terms of a prediction for the future, Marx was incorrect. But in terms of a critique of capitalism, there are ideas that Marx presents in the middle of the 19th century that are still relevant today. But we'll come on to the Communist Manifesto in more detail in a minute. So that's Karl Marx. Second up, and again, like I said, socialism is a very varied and diverse ideology. Vladimir Lenin led the Bolsheviks during the revolution in Russia in the early 20th century. Now, what's interesting is that Marx, at the end of the Communist Manifesto, lays out the position of the revolution across Europe. Marx honestly believes that if a revolution is going to happen anywhere, it's going to happen in England first. And the reason for that is he sees that capitalism is more developed in England than elsewhere in Europe. And for him, the more developed a state becomes and the more developed capitalism becomes, the more exploitation takes place and revolution becomes more likely. For Marx, it is a long and painful road to socialism. Lenin doesn't like that, and vaguely inspired by Marx's ideas, he believes that he can inspire revolution. And what he believes is that a vanguard, a party, can bring revolution. So for Marx, class consciousness, becoming aware that you are exploited by the powers that be, class consciousness comes naturally over a long period of time. Lenin thinks that a political party can bring consciousness to the people by making them aware of the exploitation. For Marx, if he was to be able to look at Lenin's socialism, he would say that is not Marxism. Therefore, we often refer to followers of Lenin as Marxist-Leninists, because it is an interpretation of Marxist socialism. Marx would look at what happened in Soviet Russia and say, that isn't communism, that isn't what I imagined communism would look like. So for Lenin, the revolution will happen, but we don't have to wait for it to happen. A violent revolution can take place, and it can be inspired by a vanguard, as he calls it, a small group of people bringing consciousness to the people. Now, both of those thinkers, although very different, are revolutionary socialists. For those two thinkers, there must and will be a revolution in order to bring about socialism. The next three thinkers we're going to talk about, still very different in what they believe, they're evolutionary socialists. They don't believe that you have to have a revolution in order to bring about socialist principles. First, we'll talk about Tony Blair, Labour Prime Minister from 1997 till 2008. Now, what's strange, I'll just move AOC out of the way, is one of his MPs on the backbench for Islington North was Jeremy Corbyn, and he was one of Tony Blair's biggest critics, and they were in the same political party. They were both elected as Labour MPs, but they have very different views. They particularly clashed over privatisation of certain industries, but also the war in Iraq and later the involvement in Afghanistan as part of the war on terror. But let's focus on Tony Blair. Tony Blair is a social democrat. Evolutionary socialists and democratic socialists, if we call them that, believe that democracy is fundamental to society. We must give people a choice, and that socialist principles can coexist with democracy. If Jeremy Corbyn and Tony Blair were Marxists, they wouldn't join a political party per se, because they don't believe that the democratic process can bring it. For Marxists, you must bring a revolution yourselves. But for Tony Blair, he was what we call a social democrat. He believed that we can lessen inequality between groups of people through progressive political policies, like the Sure Start programme, like increasing funding in education and healthcare. So the aim there is to improve both the health and the education level of the poorest in society, which should have a long-term benefit. The key thing for Tony Blair as a social democrat is he doesn't see the need to nationalise industries. That doesn't mean he wants to privatise all industry. He didn't want to privatise the NHS. But when Tony Blair comes to power in 1997, he isn't keen to sell nationalised industries, and he isn't keen for the government to take on privatised industries either. So he's happy for the economy to be in some way under private control. And this is where a key clash with Jeremy Corbyn comes in. Now, again, Jeremy Corbyn is not a Marxist, because Marxists don't believe in the democratic process. Jeremy Corbyn has been an MP for well over 20 years. Well over 30 years now. So if he didn't believe in democracy and evolutionary socialism, he wouldn't have become an MP. But Jeremy Corbyn is very different to Tony Blair. So Tony Blair is a social democrat. Jeremy Corbyn is a democratic socialist. And there is a key difference there. For a democratic socialist, you can bring about socialism, but it comes in a more aggressive form to Tony Blair's socialism. So you will remember that Jeremy Corbyn, when standing for election in 2017 and 2019, had a policy that the British government would nationalise the railways, a policy that Tony Blair would very much oppose. Jeremy Corbyn believes in a different tax system to Tony Blair, in that the richest are taxed higher, and wanted to increase the upper limit of tax and lower the threshold at which you started paying that tax. So in 2017, anyone who earned over £123,000 would pay 45% in tax. Now, that isn't 45% on every penny that person owns. It means that when their earnings get to £123,000, that is when the new tax, the graduated tax, comes into effect. Another thing that Jeremy Corbyn was in favour of was increased government spending. And again, Tony Blair's position on this is slightly different. An example, again, of increased government spending would be the amount of money that would go into paying for the renationalisation of the railways. And so high tax, high spending is a policy that became associated with the Jeremy Corbyn-led Labour Party. Now, of course, we now have a new Labour leader in Keir Starmer. I would suggest that his politics is closer to Tony Blair than it is to Jeremy Corbyn. But remember that Keir Starmer did serve in Jeremy Corbyn's shadow cabinet as shadow Brexit secretary. So even though they had differences in their politics and their ideology, they still found it possible to work together. And finally, socialism in America has often been a dirty word. In the 1950s, if you studied history at GCSE, you will know about McCarthyism. And the idea of McCarthyism is that Robert McCarthy, Senator McCarthy, believed that the American government had been infiltrated by communists, and there were some aggressive and poorly executed trials and interviews of suspected communists in the United States. Socialism has quite often been a dirty word in American politics. Very few American politicians will refer to themselves as socialists. And that's because America was founded upon liberal principles, very classically liberal. If you want to refresh your knowledge of classic liberalism, you just have to look at the American Constitution, the protection of natural rights and natural property. So socialism is not going to be a natural fit with the American system of government as laid out by the Constitution. But in recent years, socialism has become more attractive, particularly to younger voters, and it's becoming less of a dirty word in American politics. Now, we could use Bernie Sanders as our example here, but I've already got 4 pictures of old white men on screen, and so I thought I would go for someone who is up and coming in American politics, and that is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Now, she is in the House of Representatives for the state of New York, was very much a grassroots politician. She won the Democrat primary against a fellow Democrat against the odds, and in America would be referred to as a progressive Democrat. And the reason why AOC would be referred to as such is because of her policies on things like Medicare for all. So in America, they do not have a basic universal healthcare system. There are ways for the very poor and for pensioners to get limited healthcare coverage, but the vast majority of Americans who do have healthcare coverage are able to do so privately. So they pay for their health insurance privately. AOC wants Medicare for all, basically, which means that any American citizen can access basic, comprehensive medical insurance. And that is because in America, 9% of Americans are uninsured. Now, 9% doesn't seem like a lot of people, but that roughly translates to about 40 million people in America without healthcare insurance. And so that has led to huge problems for American citizens in terms of paying for healthcare if things go wrong. One example that circulated online a couple of years ago, and it's an isolated example, is a hospital was charging mothers for skin-to-skin contact after birth. And so as part of the bill, there was a $40 charge for the midwife to hand the newborn baby to the mother for the mother to hold that baby. Now, that is a one-off example, but it goes to show that a lot of the things that we in Britain take advantage of through the NHS is not available in America. So I guess what I'm trying to say as I'm rambling on is that socialism is a very varied, very different ideology depending on the type of socialist that you are. And so when people make general statements like Jeremy Corbyn is a Marxist, or they say Tony Blair isn't a socialist at all, those sweeping statements are inaccurate. They are just different types of socialism, which is an incredibly wide and varied ideology. Okay, let me give you a bit of background on Marx and his good pal Friedrich Engels. Let's talk about their relationship first. Engels was the son of a textile mill owner in Salford, and so he was part of that middle class bourgeoisie, as Engels and Marx call that group. He was part of that middle class. His father was a factory owner, but he still bought into and believed in socialist principles. And one thing that Engels does is he does a tour of the Northwest, and he writes about the working class in England. And you will not be surprised to hear that the book was called The Condition of the Working Class in England. And actually, he spends a lot of his time in the Northwest. So he does visit Bolton. And he refers to Bolton as a dark, unattractive hole. And he writes sort of lyrically about the misery that the people of Bolton live in. He says there is but one street in Bolton, Deansgate, and you would think a river runs through it when actually it's the filth running through the centre of the town. It's very emotive language and very hyperbolic. It's exaggerated, but it's getting the point across that people in Bolton and in surrounding towns in the northwest, in Bury, in Oldham, in Stockport, in Rochdale, all of these areas, he's writing about these towns to say that these people are living in misery and squalor, and something needs to be done. Engels is very much the money behind the operation. He's a middle class individual. He can rely on money. Karl Marx is not entirely the brains behind the operation, because I don't think that's fair to Engels, but he is the intellectual. And Marx, because he is a stateless person, because he is without an income, Marx relies on Engels. Engels is basically a charity for Marx. He pays to keep Marx in a house. Marx marries Jenny von Westphalen, so he marries into the German aristocracy. However, when they end up living in London, they end up living in squalor. They end up living in poverty. Jenny does her best to keep the household together, but it is quite a difficult existence for them both. Now, Marx and Engels consistently write letters to one another. They meet. So famously, Marx and Engels edited and wrote part of the Communist Manifesto in a pub in Manchester. And so they're incredibly close. And just to give you an idea of how close these two guys are, when Marx has an illegitimate child with the maid in the house in which he lives, to keep Jenny unawares, or to keep people unawares of what has happened, Engels claims the child as his own and pays for its upkeep. And that just goes to show how close these two guys are. Another interesting thing is Marx famously had terrible handwriting which you could not understand, and Engels was one of the very few people who could understand his handwriting. So although an intellectual, a man with a brilliant mind, who could come up with these incredibly complex ideas, Engels often transcribed what Marx had written so that other people could understand it. So, let's talk about how Marx views the world. Marx believes in historical materialism. And basically that means that history has certain chapters. And this idea came from a German philosopher known as Hegel. So he sort of developed from Hegelian ideas two key ideas. First of all, this idea of historical materialism, that history has chapters. The second thing, and this is important as well, is dialectical change. So Marx believes that for everything that exists, there is an opposite. So for every theory, there is an antithesis. And eventually, those two will come head to head. And what we will end up with at the end is a synthesis, which is a change that results from the clash. So that's how Marx views history. If something exists, there will be something that opposes it, and those two things will eventually come to a head and clash, and one will win out. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about historical materialism, the stages of history. First of all, primitive man, cavemen. There's no economic organisation. You are existing to survive. There are no banks. There are no schools. There's no education. There's a very primitive language. You exist in very small groups, as a family or maybe as a slightly larger tribe, and there is no economic organisation. The next stage of history for Marx is then slavery. So we jump forward now to ancient Greece, ancient Egypt, even further back, and that is when one group of humans who are more equipped in terms of their military might or numbers, sheer numbers, are able to make other human beings their property. And they provide the means of production. So basically, a stronger group in society control the lives of another in order to make wealth for them. So we the second stage, slavery, we could think of as of ancient Egypt, where we've got huge masses of people who are without power, who are the property of those in charge, building these fantastic pyramids, which are basically burial sites for the pharaohs. And actually, pharaohs would be buried sometimes with their favourite slaves, who were often alive at the time that happened. From slavery emerges feudalism. So we're now jumping forward, beyond ancient Rome to, let's say, the medieval period. So the years leading up to and after 1066. So what we get after slavery is a monarch that doesn't control people but the land. And this is where the economy relies on land rather than other people. So in the age of slavery, how many people you own dictates your wealth. In the age of feudalism, it's all about land. And basically what the king does is rents the land to lords, lords rent it to knights, knights lend it to peasants, and the wealth sort of makes its way up that pyramid from the poor paying to rent the land, right up to the one individual at the top. So that's stage number 3. Stage number 4 is capitalism. So as far as Marx is concerned, when he is writing in the mid-19th century, he is living in the age of capitalism. And that is because feudalism creates two classes. So eventually Marx sees that people will get rid of the idea that the king or queen rules simply because God has ordained it. Remember, Marx is very anti-religion in that regard. So capitalism is when a middle class emerges and controls the wealth, and the working class earn that wealth for them. So the working class work, they produce excess value and they are exploited. And it's the middle class that make the money. So let me give you an example. Let's say that you work at making chairs. And Marx gives this example in the Communist Manifesto as someone who makes a chair. Let's say you make a chair and the wood you've got for, let's say, £5. So the wood to make it and the glue to make it, everything you need to make this chair costs you £5. You put your work in, which for Marx has a value as well. So the work that you put in has a value as well. But when this chair is eventually made, you pass it on to your boss, who then sells it. Let's say you make 4 in that day, and the boss has decided that the value of each individual chair is £10. So the boss is making £5. He is doubling his profit. So the excess value per chair is £5. So every day that you make 4 chairs, the proletariat, the working class, is being exploited to the tune of £20 a day. And that happens day after day, week after week, month after month. For Marx, the only way for a capitalist to succeed is to keep exploiting its workforce. So Marx imagines 2 bosses. If we have a boss that then begins to charge less money for the chair, well, you're going to buy the cheaper chair if it's of better quality. But in order to do that, you need to pay your workers less. So let's say a new chair maker comes along and instead of selling his chairs at £10, starts selling them at £8 to beat the competition. But what he needs to do to keep his profit high is to cut those wages. So instead of £5 a chair, you're now getting £2.50 a chair. So the price for the middle class buying this chair is getting cheaper, but the exploitation is increasing because workers are getting exploited. A modern day example will be, your fast fashion outlets like Primark. And when you sort of pick up a piece of clothing from Primark, I know you pick it up and think, oh, this t-shirt's only £6, what a bargain. What you need to think of is, when we take cost out of this, how much is the employer paying the worker to make this for it to only be £6? So for Marx, this is the problem with capitalism. It relies on exploiting the majority of the people. And that can carry on for a while, but it can't carry on for forever. So the rest of the stages of history that I'm going to go through is a prediction from Marx. So the next chapter in history is the emergence of class consciousness. So the working class who are exploited day in, day out by capitalism. And according to Marx, that exploitation will only get worse with time. So that exploitation gets worse and worse and worse. Eventually, the proletariat realise that they are being exploited and they decide as a group, we are going to do something about it. For Marx, this is the crucial stage of history, when the working class realises its power, its strength in numbers, and realises that the economic system will collapse without them, they have a revolution. And so we come to stage number 6, the destruction of capitalism through revolution. So for Marx, capitalism has to become more and more exploitative with time. There will be an end point where the people have had enough and there is a revolution. It will be bloody, people will die. For Marx, this isn't something that he wants to happen. This is something that he says must and will happen according to the stages of history. So after the destruction of capitalism, we get to stage 7, which is socialism. Socialism is the dictatorship of the proletariat. So the proletariat control the bourgeoisie. And as you can imagine, and Marx predicts, the proletariat are going to be incredibly bitter as a result of their exploitation. So we are going to see policies like seizing the wealth of the wealthiest in society, seizing the means of production. So by that I mean taking control of the factories, taking the profit away from the bourgeoisie and putting it into the hands of those that make the wealth, which is the proletariat, the working class. However, what will happen in this stage of history is society will level out. The two classes will become indistinguishable. So the bourgeoisie and the proletariat are no longer two distinct groups. There is a withering away of the class system. And Marx calls this a classless society. Everyone ends up in the same economic group. That leads us to stage number 8. And this is why Karl Marx would say that what happened in Russia in the 20th century was not socialism. Because at stage 8, we get the withering away of the state. With a fair and equal society where everybody's rights are upheld and we have sort of fairness in terms of economic justice, if we can call it that, if we have a fair society, there is no need for the state to govern. So that the purpose for Marx of the capitalist state is to keep the proletariat in their place, to make sure that the bourgeoisie are superior and continue to be superior. For Marx, the socialist state is to redress the imbalances in society. When those imbalances have gone, when they have disappeared, there is no need for the state and the state will wither away. That is why Marx would say that what Lenin and later Stalin did in Russia is not socialism, because the state got more powerful, not less powerful. And that leads us finally to stage 9, which is what Marx calls communism, the end of history. So for him, the end of history, the final stage of history is communism. There is no state that needs to fix the imbalances in society because those imbalances have been eliminated. And so we end up in a strange way, similar to stage 1 in history, where there is no government economic organisation, but rather than it being primitive, this is the most developed society, one in which fairness and justice for all is applied to all. Now, the way in which Marx's teachings have been interpreted by Lenin, by Stalin, by other socialists who may call themselves communists, the way in which they've been interpreted have led many people to say that Marx was sort of inciting revolution. And in some ways, when we move on to look at the manifesto, you might be right. But I think what we need to keep in mind is that for Marx, this is a prediction. Everything from stage 5 onwards, class consciousness onwards, everything from stage 5 onwards is a prediction. It's not an instruction, he is predicting the future. In that sense, Marx was wrong. There was not revolution in England because he believed that's where it would first be. These proletariat revolutions did not occur everywhere. Where there were revolutions, the state didn't wither away. The state got more powerful. Capitalism has evolved and adapted to survive way beyond what Marx predicted it would. But when we are going to move on now to the Communist Manifesto, when we look at it as a critique of capitalism, as a criticism of how capitalism fails some people and rewards a minority, that is where Marx is still useful today. in as an economic analysis. It doesn't mean that Marx is right. It doesn't mean that we should all believe what Marx says. What it means is that his criticism nearly 200 years ago is still applicable today. Okay, let's have a quick chat about the Communist Manifesto. You can see there different publications in different languages, very early publications of the Communist Manifesto. So you can see that it's spread from country to country, and the ideas applied, not just in Europe, but in America and also in other parts of the world as well. So, As such a relatively small document, it's only 18,000 words. You know, if you do a master's, you might end up writing a thesis that's longer than the Communist Manifesto, because some thesis can be 20,000 words. So pound for pound, it's probably one of the most influential documents of the 19th century because of how powerful but short it was. Now, the Communist Manifesto has been used by repressive governments to basically justify their policies, which often don't fit with Marx's and Engels' theories. As I've said, this is not the first communist. It's certainly the first attempt to describe what communism stood for. You can see there it says the manifesto of the Communist Party. That is because there were very many different so-called communist parties across Europe at that time. So this is not sort of the birth of communism, more an attempt to give it a definition. Now, it's a very powerful document. I often say with our philosophers like John Locke, and even somebody like John Rawls, particularly when we're in the realms of philosophy, when somebody can say something in 10 words, they'd rather say it in 100. And if you're doing RS and you're looking at faith and ethics, you'll know what I mean. Philosophers, if they can say something in 10 words, will turn it into a paragraph. For this is very different. This is written almost like a horror story. It uses very emotive language, the idea being to inspire people to take up the cause. And I'll give you some examples in a minute. And some very powerful metaphors are used. So this is a very emotive document. It's trying to use traditional tactics to sort of persuade people to buy into the communist cause. And the very first sentence is, "A spectre is haunting Europe, the spectre of communism." So spectre is another term for a ghost. So the fact that Marx and Engels believe in communism and its virtues, the fact that they've referred to it as a ghost haunting Europe is an immediately quite scary and quite powerful metaphor. Basically, what Marx and Engels are saying is communism is coming. This is inevitable. This will happen. And so the manifesto is split up into different chapters. The first chapter is the longest of the whole manifesto, and it focuses on the middle class, the bourgeoisie. And what Marx does is he actually outlines what the middle class has done for advancing history. Because for Marx, every step into these new chapters of history is a positive step. And so what Marx actually does is he concedes positive things that capitalism has brought about. But there are criticisms in there. So let me give you one quote from chapter 1. "The modern bourgeois society that has sprouted from the ruins of feudal society has not done away with class antagonisms. It has established new classes, new conditions of oppression, new forms of struggle in the place of old ones." So what Marx and Engels are saying here is capitalism has got rid of feudalism and the evils of feudalism, but in its place have emerged new inequalities. Another thing that Marx and Engels admire about capitalism is its ability to bring all different nations and groups of people under its wing. And so they write, "The bourgeoisie draws all, even the most barbarian, nations into civilization. The cheap prices of commodities are the heavy artillery with which it batters down all Chinese walls. It compels all nations, on the pain of extinction, to adopt the bourgeoisie mode of production. It compels them to introduce what it calls civilization into their midst, i.e., to become bourgeois themselves. In one word, it creates a word in its In one word, it creates a world in its own image. Basically, what Marx is saying is when capitalism grows and spreads, other countries fear that they get left behind. And because of the cheap prices, which rely on exploitation, it becomes attractive to other countries as well. Marx and Engels end the chapter by then predicting the downfall of capitalism and the bourgeoisie. And again, listen for the powerful use of metaphors. Modern bourgeois society, with its relations of production, of exchange and of property, a society that has conjured up such gigantic means of production and of exchange, is like the sorcerer who is no longer able to control the powers of the netherworld whom he has called up by his spells. Basically, the middle class will lose control by creating these great factories and with it factory towns, and these people flock to the towns for work. What it has created is an uncontrollable swell of people who are exploited, and it will get to the point where those people will realise and take over. And so the sorcerer that can no longer control the powers are the factory owners. And finally, chapter 1 ends with, what the bourgeoisie therefore produces above all are its own grave diggers. Its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable. So what Marx is saying here is that the working class and the revolution will bring about the end of the bourgeoisie. So we focused on the middle class. Chapter 2, he talks about the proletarians. What Marx now does is he talks about the difference between current politics and the Communist Party. And what he does is outlines what communism stands for. So he says that the immediate aim of the communists is to form the proletariat into a class, overthrow bourgeois supremacy and conquest of political power. The distinguishing feature of communism is not the abolition of property generally, but the abolition of bourgeois property. In this sense, the theory of communists may be summed up in a single sentence: abolition of private property. Now you can see why the middle class of Europe was terrified by this. You know, a minority in society that own grand homes and factories and land. Marx is saying that's no longer yours. Communism will take over. So for Marx, private property is immoral and it's wrong. When he was a young boy growing up in Germany, traditionally the villagers would go into a forest, a local forest, to collect firewood for the winter. Until one summer when the forest was bought and was under private property, and they were told that they could no longer have their firewood, and therefore houses would go cold, people would contract illnesses. So that was one of the earliest examples that Marx saw of the evils of private property. One thing that Marx does is he says that communists, the working and the working class, they don't have a nation. You are not an English communist or a British communist or a Welsh communist. He says that the working men have no country. The proletariat must consider itself the nation. What he's saying there is that the working class should stand in solidarity with each other regardless of where they're from. So for Marx, an English and a German member of the working class have more in common than an English member of the proletariat and an English member of the bourgeoisie. And that idea is why a lot of socialists refused to fight in the First World War, because what they saw in their interpretation in the First World War was working class boys from England fighting working class boys from Germany while the middle class stayed in positions of power. They saw it as poor men going to fight a rich man's war. Another thing that Marx says, and he makes it very clear, he says communism abolishes all religion. So Marx, as well as having dangerous, political views, he's very open with his atheism as well. And what Marx sets out is 10 points of things the communists stand for. The first one is the abolition of private property. The second one is a heavy graduated income tax. The third, abolition of rights of inheritance. So you would those hereditary rights to peerages, to land, to property would be taken away. Number 5, the creation of a national bank. And then finally, the final point, free education for children in all public schools and an abolition of factory labour for children. So some of these points, like abolition of private property, to us are still revolutionary today. But if we listen to point number 10 and point number 5, it doesn't seem so strange. The creation of a national bank. Now, for Marx, he wanted one bank run by the state. We don't have that today, but we do have a Bank of England. And nations have their central banks. And then number 10, free education for children in public schools and an abolition of child labour. Those are two things that I hope we would all agree with Karl Marx on that one. So in those 10 points, some of them are revolutionary even today, some of them not so much. In chapter 3, Marx and Engels distinguish between previous movements and this movement. And this is one of the ironies of the manifesto. I would refer to Engels as a bourgeois socialist. He believes in socialism, but he's a member of the middle class. His father owns textile mills in Salford. But in this chapter, Marx and Engels basically say that these people cannot be true socialists because they don't belong to the working class. And another thing that Marx and Engels sort of don't have much time for is people like Robert Owen, the so-called utopians. He says they want to improve the condition of every member of society. They habitually appeal to society at large without the distinction of class. They reject all political and especially all revolutionary action. They wish to attain their ends by peaceful means, necessarily doomed to failure. So Marx and Engels are distinguishing themselves from the Robert Owens of the world, saying you're not going to succeed. You're trying to appeal to everybody, and that's not going to work. In chapter 4, we get the final and shortest chapter of the manifesto. It basically lays out the position of communism in each nation. So he starts with France, then Switzerland, Poland, England, and Germany. Marx and Engels think Germany is on the precipice of a bourgeois revolution, and a proletarian revolution will follow. Interestingly, Marx and Engels believe that England is closest to revolution. Russia isn't even mentioned. So the country that we can point to in the 20th century who had some form of a communist revolution, not the one that Marx and Engels anticipated, the country that had a revolution, Marx and Engels didn't even consider because it hadn't even reached that stage of capitalism. It was still very much an agricultural economy at that stage. The final sentences of the manifesto are, of course, the most powerful and, again, the emotive language. They say, communists everywhere support every revolutionary movement against the existing social and political order of things. Communists disdain to conceal their views and aims. They openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. Let the ruling classes tremble at a communistic revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries unite. And so a powerful end to a powerful piece of writing. Now, we don't have to buy into the ideas of Marx and Engels to admit that. So when we talk about the metaphors and the use of language, please don't sort of confuse this for me advocating communism. Far from it. But I think that we don't have to buy into the idea to appreciate the power of the message. Because working men in particular, but working families across Britain and elsewhere, across the nations of Europe, read this manifesto and bought into socialist principles in one way or another. So I hope that has given us something of an insight into our first key thinker. And I guess Marx and Engels share that stage as key thinker number one. The first thing I want to do when we get back to school is look at how socialism views human nature, the economy, the state and society. Okay, the final thing I want to say is, obviously I'm recording this before we go back to school. I know things are going to be weird and different and difficult for us all to adapt to, but I'm hoping that this is going to be easier and more manageable than having a full term over Zoom. I appreciate all the work you put in last year. I think the good news is it's looking as though the exam is going to be pushed back. They're not taking any content out of the exam, but it looks as though we have a little bit more time to get through the stuff. I am going to try and get socialism done by October half term, where we then hopefully will be able to move on to America, and we'll start by looking at the election. Obviously, by the time we start studying it, the election will be a matter of days away. So if you find yourself, I'm sure you are already, but keep an eye on the news with regards to the American election and what's happening. It will be a big help after the October half term. But I guess what I want to say really is thank you for everything last year. I appreciate how tough it was. I'm hoping that when things get back, I'm sure it will take a bit of time to adapt and get used to it, but I think that it will be better. I'm a little bit apprehensive about going back to school, so if you see me with a mask or a visor on, that's my sort of personal choice. That's something I've decided to do for my own health. What you choose to do with regards to what school says is completely up to you, and I respect that decision. But I'm hoping that you will all be looking forward to being back in school and sort of slowly getting back to normal, whatever normal is going to look like in this school year. So thank you so much for all your help. I hope everyone is well and well rested and looking forward to being back, because I certainly am. So yeah, thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed catching up on socialism and listening to me ramble on. And I will see you in September.